Hello again. Thank you for coming back. My name is Mohammed Al-Haj Ali. I'm a fellow at Carnegie Middle East Center. And our panel is on preventing radicalization outside the MENA region. With me, we have Margarita Bizina, and she is an affiliate with the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society, and also Dr. Bibi van Ginkel, and she is a senior research fellow at the Klingendale Institute. She focuses on legal aspects of combating terrorism and prevention of radicalization in both a national and international contexts. And also we have with us Friedrich Lindsey. He is a desk officer and educational assistant at the Violence Prevention Network in Berlin. The great thing about this panel, I would say, is basically it has a combination of expertise on radicalization, countering violence, violent extremism, and also a legal aspect, which I think would be interesting to look at in this panel. So I will start with. We will start with interventions from each of our speakers, and then we will move on to questions and also questions from the public. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference today. It's a pleasure. And the question and the topic of my presentation is some characteristics of radicalization. So who and how. This presentation would have primarily a Canadian perspective with a bit of North American and Western European accent, as well as a mention of Russian extremists. So, is there a typical path for radicalization? I would like to quote recent publication from a Canadian Security Intelligence Service, where the researchers stated that radicalization is a highly individualized process through which a person becomes convinced that violence is legitimate means to advance their ideological cause or beliefs. It is influenced by factors such as personal history, peer pressure, grievances, charismatic ideologues, and international events. So it is safe to say that there is a typical path for radicalization in North America and Western Europe, with such steps as a search for a greater cause by people who are becoming radicalized, a search for a sense of identity. Then comes the meeting with a charismatic figure, either in person or online, an integration or becoming part of a network, and finally, the desire or a wish to affect political change. In Russia, the existence of strong separatist movement in Chechnya and Dagestan is making the path slightly different, with the emphasis being on the desire to affect political change. I have a quote from Dagestani youth saying that in Dagestan, radicalization is seen as social protest in religious form, where young people have a strong sense of identity and are fighting for their land as they see their religious leaders being too weak in their eyes to affect change. So we can see there is a sort of a connotation with the North America as well, where there is a desire to affect political change. But it is important to note that in Russia, the society is closer to the collectivist mentality as opposed to postmodern individualism of North America and Western Europe, which means that close familial and social ties, as well as the legacy of world wars, with strong nationalism, create a relatively closely knit community where young people are observed much better by their family and friends, as they are in North America, where individualism is key at the moment. So the next question then, is there a typical profile for radicalized individuals? And we can definitely say no, there is no typical profile. However, we should note that it is mostly a revolt against the system where the youth do not feel socially, psychologically, or economically. They experience a sense of loneliness and, most importantly, a crisis of identity. So we can say that some common characteristics are, at least in North America and Western Europe, These people are usually immigrants or children of immigrants. They're largely converts. They're young, predominantly male, are not poor, have minimal or no criminal past, and are not mentally ill. I could quote here also from an interview with a girl who was a white supremacist in Canada, because her words are going to resonate even with the radicalized individual's profile, not profile, but a characteristic that we are portraying here. She stated that by the time I was 16, I was really angry. I had dropped out of high school, and I didn't have any friends, and I didn't feel like I belonged. I wasn't quite Canadian, I wasn't Romanian anymore, and so I had a lot of the same risk factors that drive other people to radicalization. And the Heritage Front, which is a white nationalist organization, happened to be there. These are her words. Luckily, she now has turned her way around. So, to sort of show you some examples and explain that all young individuals like that are different but do share some characteristics, here are Tsarnaev brothers, who were at the time of the attack 20 and 26 respectively, when they detonated a bomb during Boston Marathon in April of 2013. They moved from Dagestan to the United States of America and received asylum. Their mother was becoming radicalized, and their parents divorced in 2011 and left the children in America. Older brother lost the possibility to advance to Olympic boxing as he was not a citizen, and he also stated that there are no values anymore, and became radicalized during his trip to Dagestan. His younger brother struggled academically and had a financial debt to his university, and it is likely that he was influenced by his older brother on his path to radicalization. Another example is Martin Couture-Rouleau, who was 25 at the time of his attack. He drove a vehicle into Canadian soldiers and killed one in October of 2014. He was separated from his partner and his son. His business was failing. He converted to Islam a year before and became radicalized while watching YouTube videos. He even convinced some of his friends to convert as well, but they did not like his extreme views. He was mad that Canada was supporting the American bombing of ISIS. A third example is Michael Zehav Bibi, who was 32 at the time of the attack. That was when he shot and killed Corporal Nathan Cirillo, who was on guard at the National Monument, and then he stormed the Parliament Hill in Ottawa in Canada. He had a problem with drugs. He lived in shelters when he was housed in British Columbia. He also had an assault file out of Montreal. His parents divorced in 1999, and he spiraled into drugs because he was left to his own devices while his parents were at work and he had parties at home. He felt wronged by his family, and he cut ties with them. His views were even more intolerant than those of the mosque that he attended. As some of his acquaintances said, his argument was that we live a decadent and immoral lifestyle, that we live godlessly, and that we must be taught a lesson and be punished. When he was in Ottawa shelter in Ontario, people said that he looked lost, lonely, and in search of something. He also had a problem obtaining a passport, therefore his plans to travel were thwarted, and that may have been a trigger for him to go and attack in Ottawa. And my final example is Aaron Driver, who at the time of the offense was 25 years old, and that happened in August of 2016. Now, this young individual was lonely and had two very tragic events that happened to him in his lifetime. He lost his mother when he was only 7 years old. He also lost his child, who was stillborn, when he was only 19 years old. He was unable to connect with youth wherever he lived, and he turned to online community and found a righteous online community. The mosques which he went to were too progressive and did not tolerate his conservative views. He also started recruiting young kids. And He met the online supporters and befriended some of the most zealous ISIS supporters online. So there is a common theme here, right?
They all need a hug, it seems.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. So we can say that the key drivers of radicalization are the lack of purpose in life, the need for sense of belonging, yes, you are absolutely correct, the social isolation and alienation, the grievances, whether real or perceived, crisis of identity, discrimination, and personal trauma. I would like to note, though, that in Russia, the two most important factors are discrimination and political landscape. Environments conducive to radicalization, because people don't do everything in a vacuum, right? Dysfunctional families, where issues of assimilation and integrations are not discussed. Community of conspicuous consumption, where people work long hours to acquire more things, spend time on devices, instead of talking to family members, and send parents to old folks' homes. Now, I know that is purely a North American thing, but I should put it here. People don't know their neighbors and become increasingly isolated in a mostly virtual world. And the final point that I think is of key importance is the absence of role models, especially for young men in fatherless families. So our sense of happiness nowadays comes from acquiring things, food and drugs. We no longer gain happiness via familial conversation. This is a preview of North American, Western European country where there is no greater goal for young people. Some immigrant children do not feel 100% Canadian, and they are susceptible to purified Islam, wishing to belong to a global community. They see the decadent West, and they separate from parents by joining that purified Islam. In Russia, however, there exists a xenophobic community, extreme nationalism, and disrespect towards North Caucasus region, which is the environment conducive to radicalization of youth. So who are the key actors and who are the key targets? The key actors are charismatic individuals in places of worship, social organizations and schools, radical clerics whose speeches are available online, and a loose online network of ISIS supporters and recruiters. And I say loose because it looks more like a business conglomerate than a tightly knit community. The key targets for these actors are socially isolated young men and women, lonely and lacking a strong sense of identity, and mostly misinformed about Islam and Western foreign policy. The extremist groups look for people who have been physically, sexually, or emotionally abused, have higher predisposition to becoming radicalized, are socially isolated. And for these young individuals, it's not really the subject matter, but it's mostly the human connection that the targets are seeking. So what is then the recruitment mechanism? In active recruitment, we have direct personal contact, offering acceptance and social ties. We have a teaching of radical ideas as an answer to their grievances, whether real or perceived. We have group exercises, and finally, the mobilization to violence. In a passive recruitment, we would see online propaganda, especially with YouTube videos and Twitter tweets. And then comes a response to interested individuals from those people who post the radical message online with a promise of acceptance and glory. They promise to give them a sense of greater goal. What are the triggers then? And what is the process? Because you can be radicalized, but not violent, right? From radicalization to violence, this is sort of a ladder, so to speak. There is a grievance, real or perceived. Then there is an ideation, the stage of research and planning, preparation, breach, and finally attack. The trigger events that would lead a person to take on this path are death in the family, divorce, whether from partner or parental divorce, financial ruin, humiliation, and a political event in the larger community. I know, I'm almost done. That's my last slide. The financing of such activities and the usual channels used by terrorist cells. Young people often have to sell their personal belongings on their path to violence. They often work and save their wages while they live in their parents' houses. They may engage in petty theft, and they do collect donation from sympathizers online. Now, how do these funds travel? I am sure you're all aware of the Hawala system. I don't need to explain that here. But what we've noticed more in the past few years is bitcoins. And if someone is not aware, it is a process of creating a digital wallet that no one else can access unless the person has a set of keywords that need to be produced in a certain order. There is no trace, as the Bitcoin system is not tied to any government or central bank. Therefore, we are having no tools to find where the money is going and where it's coming from. That is all.
Thank you very much. That's really great. We're going to move to Bibi for Dr. Bibi for her intervention, please.
Thank you very much, Mohamed, for the introduction. By the introduction, you might expect the affiliation to be Klingendahl and ICCT, and although I'm still affiliated, I actually recently started my own organization called the GloCal Connection Platform for Shared Security. So, hence the the title. First of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me here to Beirut to participate in this topic, and it's great to actually looking at the issues Syria and Iraq, but also to reflect on the policies that have been developed over the years, and to think again on whether or not we are actually effective, because that should be the lead question in everything that we do. Now, the organizers are certainly very ambitious, and although I really do like having a good ambition, it's almost an impossible task to cover everything that they ask me, to reflect on all the tools developed in Europe, the United States and Russia, the legal tools, and also to reflect on the effectiveness of it all, particularly on financial countering the financing of terrorism, and so on. So I'll do my best to first of all give you an overview, but a little disclaimer: my expertise is very wide, but in terms of the policies and the frameworks, I'm more of a specialist on what the EU has done and done some research on that. So I will briefly touch on the issues in the US, but I have no knowledge of the home policies in Russia, so please forgive me for that. So briefly starting with the question, if we are looking at preventing radicalization, first of all, that is already something that you can debate. What's wrong with radicalization as such, as my colleague already mentioned here as well, is rather the radicalization towards violence. That is something that we should be worried about. So, but preventing radicalization, the question is then, what are we actually targeting? Then looking briefly at the various tools in counterterrorism, countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism. It's always a little bit of an alphabet soup with the CT, CVE and PVE. Particular legal frameworks, but also looking at beyond legal frameworks, for instance in administrative law. And then other tools, for instance on strategic communication, community engagement, empowerment and skills training. But also the nexus with development aid, particularly when it comes to development, and then the effectiveness questions. So let's first say that what is important to realize is with everything that we do, it needs to be context specific to be effective. If you don't have a good understanding of what's really the issue in a particular context, you will not be able to choose wisely from this large box of instruments that you might carry and tools that you might carry with you to know which one will work in what situation. And of course, there needs to be a connection to what is done on the national level, on the global level, but also on the national level and on the local level. And then the other question is, are we preventing or preventing? And you might think she's saying the same thing, but what we've seen over the years, and I've been around already quite some time, and over 2 decades of working in this field, have seen quite some shifts in policy. Preventing in the beginning was mostly focused on preventing with hard policies, preventing something to happen by repressing. So preventing in legislation meant also criminalizing certain activities that are prior to the actually committing of a terrorist attack. And there are some things to say for that, certainly, but the other way of talking about preventing is really in taking away these root causes, these conditions conducive to radicalization towards violent extremism, and to address those grievances and the issues of lack of governance or rule of law, etc. Now, for Europe, when thinking about what it is that we're actually targeting when talking about prevention, you could say it's about the radicalization among a certain youth or susceptible community. I might disagree on some of your profile issues, but in Europe, from our research, it turns out that quite a number do have a criminal background and had a quick path of radicalization in a very short amount of time, a sort of a clean slate that was offered to them to redeem themselves and to set aside what they've done before, but to find a purpose. That part I fully agree on. So understanding what's going on, these grievances, these perceptions, these feelings of marginalization, the identity crisis that some of them experience, and yes, radical views of their religious belief can also be part of that. But in Europe, what we've seen is that it's rather the radicalization as such, and then Islam as a religion is sort of the vehicle that is used, or we could rather say abused, than the other way around. So, but not to say that that other path does not take place. Now, another thing to target when talking about prevention is, of course, hate speech. So the ones who are actually trying to convince others with the way that they preach. And use their very extremist narratives, including via the internet and social media, and also by being invited to events to speak. It could be through influencing and infiltration in educational systems or institutions, and also by the money flows that go into these institutions. It could be through infiltration in NGOs, and this will come back when thinking about how to counter the financing of terrorism, how to address that. And yes, there is a nexus between crime and terrorism, not only because people step out of crime to start terrorism, but they do bring quite an impressive CV sometimes that might be of use if you start this new career in terrorism. But also because of the providing of the supplies through trafficking of weapons, of explosives, or the fraud in identity papers, etc. And then there is the radicalization in prison that is considered to be a hot spot and a particular problem, but I'm sure that Friedrich will touch on that, so I'll stop there. And finally, the issue of returnees that comes back in all the intelligence and security reports as something that Western governments are very much concerned about, because these people come back with a network, they are battle hardened, they might have a frustration from failing with the caliphate, not necessarily ISIS is defeated, but the caliphate, I would say, and new plans, and also if they are not well taken care of, in the sense that security and law enforcement services pay attention to how to either prosecute them or rehabilitate them into society, this might potentially be a new problem. So just to give you a glance of what it is that we're facing if you're talking about prevention, and you can see it's already still a very wide area. Hope you can read it. But so clearly, even when I talked about what we're actually targeting, you can already imagine that you're using different tools from your toolbox. And they come from CT, the counterterrorism toolbox, which is always about isolation, about hard approaches, about criminal approaches, sometimes military approaches, but maybe not so relevant in this context. Countering violent extremism, that in this context I would say is really about the strategic communication, countering the violent extremist messages, and the prevention that might be much more about engagement and creating resilience. Now, the EU counterterrorism architecture and landscape is really very crowded. There are, first of all, many actors. I'll show you a graphic that we did for the European Parliament some time ago in the next slide, but you can see that they wanted to get an overview, and you can understand why. Sort of a roadmap, how to navigate all these actors, and also the different policy fields, because it's not just one policy field. You have legislation, you have your border control, the countering violent extremism, of finances, weapons control, data exchange, judicial cooperation, and prevention, yes. The kind that engages with society. And then there are all these different bodies and platforms that also installed and have a role to play, like Eurojust and Europol, but also the more specific ones that are listed here. Now there you go. This is who to call in the EU. Yes, they were also a little bit shocked when we showed that. Actually, this is the one that we adapted after we presented the report in the European Parliament for the LIBE committee, and they looked at our recommendations with interest, and then thought they needed a committee to actually implement these recommendations, which of course we were happy that they were taking them serious, but the orange box at the bottom is the extra organ that we created, so that part of the recommendations they kind of missed out on. I will not explain, it goes far too far to but just to give you a glimpse of how complicated things are sometimes. And this is what we mapped out, is everything that actually was adopted, and I'm happy to share this, and you can find the report online as well. And surely this is too small and detailed for you to see, but what we did is in a timeline map out the attacks, but also then the legislation that was adopted, mostly followed by kind of a roadmap or an implementation fora, and then the strategy. Normally, if you have a healthy policy cycle, it's the other way around. You do your needs assessment first, your threats assessment first, then follows a strategy, then follows a sort of a vehicle, and then follows the legislation. But here, they turn things around. And also, it's on all these different fields. So again, the various fields that I mentioned, legislation, border control, weapons trafficking, etc. So, in terms of criminal law, what has been accomplished within the EU is also the criminalization of these preparatory phases that I talked about when I said, is it prevention or prevention? So conspiracy, aiding and abetting, financing, planning, travel, and training. Now, most EU member states have adopted all of this, including criminalization of incitement to terrorism. Now, this is also something that on UN level, of course, has been highly recommended to member states to implement in Resolution 1624 of 2005. But of course, this is again very tricky. We all know that there is no one definition for the crime of terrorism. That's always to national legislation. And then there's also a not clear understanding of what one needs to do when criminalizing incitement to terrorism. So here you get a glorification or apologie. So there are all kinds of different forms that are sometimes find their way into the legislation of EU member states. With the countering of financing of terrorism, there is quite a framework of measures that are in place. I didn't list them all, but just reference to the EU framework decisions, but also the regulations and directives that have been adopted. For instance, copy-pasting the sanctions list from UN level. But then in addition to that, there are the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force regulations that give all kinds of pointers to member states to vet their procedures, and also with the private sector, so that's important. And then there are, for instance, not per se on the EU level, but you see it in different EU member states in different ways, frameworks that can deal with custodial or post-custodial measures that sort of keep a control on people if they are out of prison, to make sure that they stay on the right track or that they have to report. And then I leave the de-radicalization in prison, rehab and reintegration programs to my colleague here to talk about. Now, more on the CVE, PVE and community engagement strand. Now this becomes interesting because the EU does have a prevention strategy and a media communication strategy, but these are strategies that put out a lot of recommendations to EU and the EU member states, but are not binding. And this is always complicated. You have these differences between the binding decisions of the EU, those that really have to be incorporated by the EU and the EU member states, and some other fields that leave it to the member states for their own discretion to do what they think is best in their context. So this was, by the way, one of our recommendations to say, well, maybe you can install some kind of reporting system where states at least have to report back on their progress on what they are doing in prevention. So how you can at least engage in a dialogue on what works and what doesn't. What they did do is set up the Radicalization Awareness Network, the Center of Excellence, RAN, which has various working groups. They're listed here, and what they do is bring from different member states the practitioners working in these fields together to exchange on this. And I'm sure you can also talk from your experience in one of these working groups. More on the external foreign policy field, it's rather the European neighboring policy, the instrument to stability and peace, the strengthening of resilience to violence and extremism, STRIVE program that brings a lot of funds to good initiatives and to help states also in some regions to set up prevention programs, engagement programs, working a lot with civil society and NGOs to really work on the prevention level within the context of communities. And then lastly, on national levels, you see that some have really prevention PVE plans. There are mechanisms that really work on the local level, multi-stakeholder cooperation. You have the famous Aarhus system in Denmark, but also speaking from the experience in the Netherlands, we have what we call sort of a security house, safety house cooperation model where you bring all kinds of stakeholders on a local level to the table. So not only your hard security partners, but also your more social partners. I get a 5-minute sign, I guess. Yeah. Oh, 1 minute even. Yeah. And which is good because it gives you an opportunity to really exchange views on what the problem actually is. Right. So just a brief word on the administrative law then. This is something that falls between prevention and criminal law. Depends on the jurisdiction of states, but it when considered a threat, governments might have a role to play here. Now, with your permission, Chair, then I'll skip the US policy, as it's not really my field, and just go through the last questions that were put to me on on the effectiveness. Now, surely there are some positive points. We are much more aware of the threats, the security threats. There is uniformation in legislation. We address the cross-border problems with cross-border solutions, blurring lines between internal and external security challenges, exchange of information and judicial cooperation. Those are all very good things, but certainly there are also still things to improve. Now, one thing that I think personally is very important, so I'll concentrate on that, is the monitoring and evaluation. It's the last bullet here, which is, if you can look at this pie chart, you see that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. If you really take effectiveness of policy seriously, well, I would say it should at least be a third, but actually really half of the measures and the instruments and the tools that are used to really reflect on what is needed. You can find all these conclusions in the report that we did for the LIBE committee, so it's out there. Finally, I think what is also important is not only to concentrate on this issue of jihadism and the jihadist extremist violence that we are dealing, but there is also the right-wing extremism that is becoming more serious, and there is the interaction between the two. So that is certainly not something to forget about. Then I skip to the last one on international cooperation, and this is on the returnees. It was mentioned before, but one of the big problems in Europe is also that there is not one policy, and that here Europe is really failing, because I think the EU should really put this on the table. It's a very important topic that if ignored, it will become much worse. There are some countries that do take some steps. In the Netherlands, they also take the stand that they don't want to bring back returnees, not actively, that is to say. The phrase is, if they find their way to a consulate or an embassy, then of course, yes, we will facilitate their return, and the prosecutor will await them at Schiphol and apprehend them immediately. Now, that being said, one of the issues that really is touching me very much is how they are also talking about the children, because these are completely forgotten. These are innocent victims of maybe the choices that their parents made, but they are ticking time bombs if we leave them as they are at this moment. So I think this is really something that the EU and the EU member states should take very seriously and move forward on, because it will come and bite us in the tail if we don't. Thank you very much. And sorry for taking too long.
Friedrich, please.
All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues. I am with the Violence Prevention Network in Berlin, where I'm currently in the role of a training instructor in a project aimed at educating prison and probation officers on the topic of radicalization and extremism. Let me take a quick moment to thank the hosts of this conference, Maison du Futur, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and the Wilfried Martens Center for your kind invitation and giving me the opportunity to speak today on the topic of de-radicalization and returning fighters. When I got the invitation to this event, I was chiefly excited, and then briefly after that a little bit worried. The topic of returning fighters is highly charged and somewhat inflated in public and political debate, so I wondered how could I possibly win, in particular in a time frame of 10 minutes of speaking on this topic to you. So I think overall the topic of de-radicalization and the target group of returning fighters is somewhat abstract. So my ambition is to demystify this target group, or the image that you might have of it, a little bit by giving you some insight into our work, how we counsel returning fighters and their families and relatives, and maybe contribute to a better understanding of what this target group actually is and what makes the work with them unique. So where's the, okay. So, very briefly, I want to let you know who we are. So, as it has been mentioned by prior colleagues here today, there are civil society organizations engaged in this line of work. This might strike some of you as odd, which is understandable because this is actually very typically German. This is rooted in our post-war history where we had ambitions of redistributing power and basically generating a higher political and democratic participation of the civil society. So out of this has actually grown a political culture of collaboration between civil societies and political institutions, and actually has become a central hallmark of the political landscape in Germany. I want to touch on how this is significant in regards to the topic of my input here in just a moment. Overall, the Violence Prevention Network brings together individuals with different academic, professional backgrounds in diverse settings in working with extremists and their relatives and family members. So what is it actually that we do? We try to cover the full range of preventive work at a primary, secondary level, as well as de-radicalization, on what I want to talk about to you today. And the question on what is our approach, it actually does depend on our target group, because we started about 2 decades ago with a small pilot project aimed at engaging in dialogue with right-wing extremists that were imprisoned. And over the course of time, we realized that we could rethink our methods and broaden our scope of target groups all the way up to where we're currently engaging in counseling with returning fighters. So how do we do it? Our key method is called Verantwortungspädagogik, and I can guarantee you cannot translate that into English. So basically what the idea is that we want to generate an idea of, well, enabling self-responsive behavior of our clients, okay, reflecting to that end. So our general approach is always that we work with our clients on a voluntary basis, even in the prison system. We establish dialogue at eye level. That is very important to us, that we engage in a relationship where we that actually grounds on a listening, asking foundation that is non-confrontational and gaining trust in a relationship that grows and basically open up a space for critically reflecting their own position. So at this point, I know some of you are leaning over to your neighbors and saying that Birkenstock hippie, but just, give me a moment. I'll walk you through it, okay? I promise. So what are the central challenges and differences that we're facing in our work with this particular target group? So I've selected a few key points that our counselors repeatedly have reported back to us that at the first sight might not seem significantly different from the general target group of radicalized individuals. And I want to wrap that up with the question, does trauma and war and the experience of combat actually enhance a predisposition to violent behavior? So being disenfranchised with society is not necessarily something unique for this target group, but the degree of disconnection with society is significant. So if you think about these two physical components that actually come into place, so these individuals we're talking about actually turned their back and physically left their society. That's point one. And the other indicator is that once upon return, the likelihood is very high of them being incarcerated in prison. So, and I know from my work that I do mainly, that of course is always a significant factor of additional sense of disenfranchisement with society that goes beyond the cognitive and emotional disconnection. And this is where I want to pick up on why a civil society organization might come in very handy, because we are, by the clients, we're not perceived as members of the system. So it's really important to understand that in this initial engaging phase, when we try to offer our programs to this target group, that destructive behavior of prison personnel, judges, people of the legal and security apparatus can actually cripple this initial process very quickly. So it's really important from perspective of our counselors to raise awareness within those communities of the co-radicalizing effects their behavior might have, especially in this initial phase. So I would like to invite you to follow this line of thought, that on the path of rehabilitation and de-radicalization, we always have the initial steps of resocialization and reintegration, but I will touch on that a little bit more in detail in just a moment. So another significant factor is the media interest on the target group and the overall political and public pressure that can be felt by the clients and our counselors as well. So the critical point about that is that this pressure actually threatens the principles that are underlying in our work of establishing dialogue and building a relationship that is based on trust. So if you initially engage with a client and start making maybe minor progress or slow progress, if the impatience of other actors is too strongly felt, the client might fold up. And if that happens, the highest risk is of actually losing the working relationship with that client. So in mid and long-term perspective, if other actors are very impatient, that's not going to help a great deal, because eventually these people, at least within our judicial system, the terms that they might be sentenced to will reach up maybe to a max of 10 years. So and after that, when that person is released, that's the highest risk. So you have not worked with them at an ideological level. So at present, I can tell you that our counselors have reported that there is a high willingness and a level of cooperation within the target group actually to engage in our programs. However, it is threatened by these dynamics that I've sketched out just now. Another issue, if you want to get back to the idea of resocialization and reintegration, is the element of exposure to stigmata. Now, even in broader European debate, and you always hear this keyword integration. Well, integration doesn't work without socialization. So if you don't have an opportunity or a space that allows you initial re-socializing settings, then you will not be able to reintegrate. That is something that is commonly overlooked. So in that sense, it's really important also, if possible, once a client is released from prison, to protect his or her identity. In some really, really hard cases, of course, we always try to reactivate whatever is there as a social supportive system to intercept them once they're released from prison. But if that is not possible, it might actually, if the expectation is that they might be exposed to ridicule or harassment or whatever, it actually might make sense to relocate and find other structures, maybe through, I don't know, sports or re-educating or whatever it is that might give you access to a new social group. But that is actually not that we aim at categorically. That would be something actually only in a very difficult situation where we would say, okay, that is something that we would need to anticipate. So in the sense of resocializing and reintegrating, the family plays a significant role. So again, it's not untypical for the family ties, especially at such a degree of radicalization, that the family ties are broken or defected. So it is essential that we already start during the prison term to gradually put efforts into rehabilitating those relationships, because that, of course, would be the primary, most valuable environment for our clients to begin in small steps on their path of reintegration by having the safe environment within their family of initial resocialization. So just to come to an end gradually here is the question war, combat, and trauma, because I think this is the most significant thing resonating repeatedly in the debate, whether it's in public or political arena, is the question. Of course, the suggestion is these individuals have been engaged in combat, they've been in a combat zone, they are battle hardened, they are experienced, so ergo they have a higher potential and are a higher risk to security. Now, I can say first of all that our counselors have reported that the element of trauma is significant. So the experience of having engaged in combat, being in the war zone, has actually had a significant effect on the psychological stability of these clients. So we can observe a high demand of psychological and psychiatric treatment that is necessary. In addition to, in comparison to other target groups, let's say of individuals that have not traveled to the battle zone, is actually that the necessity of engaging with them in a much more intense dialogue of our counselors, and that means the accessibility, being reachable on the phone, reliability. So the whole construct is much more fragile and needs much more tending to when it comes to this target group. On the other hand, with the question on violence, is there an observable incline? We have to clearly say no. Actually, the experience seems to have had a contrary effect of what is being suggested in discourse. So the central perspective that our counselors are giving us is that this whole thing is very inflated to some degree. So we need to take a step back and decompress and see a little bit, to some extent, what this target group actually needs in particular. And that is, as I said, an enhanced access to, or they have a higher need for psychological and psychiatric treatment. And that is something that needs to be taken into account at a general conceptual level when we take our general multi-agency approach to this, that aside of theological-based ideological dialogue and counseling in walking through the client's biography and finding points of vulnerability and that have opened up or have opened them up to the radical mindset. We also need this component where we need to find an interconnection with professionals from the psychological and psychiatric level to have this general foundation to tend to the specific needs of this target group. And I hope I'm still within time frame.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for our speakers. Thank you. You know, just the first question which pops into my mind from listening to the three speakers is basically, you know, there are diverse backgrounds for these foreign fighters. Personal issues, you know, I've heard abuse, child abuse. I've heard, you know, poverty, you know, disruption in their flow of life, and What I wondered was whether there's whether this has an implication in the way you approach dealing with the aftermath and your program, and also in the legal framework, whether this this nuance of their backgrounds does it have any implications? Do you see it? Was there a bulk kind of approach in which you deal with all the cases as one?
Well, I think the idea in most European states that have an advanced approach, because not all have, but who have really developed over the years in approaching these issues, is that even though the law is the law, and if someone breaks the law, that they will be prosecuted for doing so, the fact that people come back with some baggage does play a role, particularly in the aftermath, in the way that they deal with for instance, the probation system afterwards. And that's when they use these multi-stakeholder safety house constructions, for instance, in the Netherlands, or the Aarhus system elsewhere, bring in various stakeholders that bring different perspectives to the problem at hand. Some come from the security sector, others have more are from the mental health institutions, others come from who help people get houses and work so that they can re-socialize indeed, work with the family also, maybe the schools. So they bring all these perspectives to make a really tailor-made approach for that particular person. And I think that is a big improvement. Although I must say that with regard to, in general, the general public's opinion on this is slightly different from how policies play out, because general public opinion is most of the time that they really put these people in the corner, saying they once made a bad decision and they have to pay for it the rest of their life, and don't burden me with whatever risk that brings if you bring them back, and just lock them up for good. Not sure that that's helpful, and certainly is in terms of how the stigmatization that was already touched upon is not having the right effect, and maybe even a counter effect. But that kind of discussions on short-term versus long-term effectiveness is very difficult for the public to follow, and also politicians in particular are not likely to entertain that division. So that's a big problem, I guess. I'll be interested also in your target group, if I may. You were mentioning the target group. How big is your target group that you were talking about when talking about how they're not likely to violent behavior? And does that compare to other studies?
So overall, just to touch on your question real quick, is you observe in this field of work always the desire to have some sort of normative, quantitative tool to this desire to generate a profile, finding common denominators. We have checklists there. Models of radicalization where you go up and down the stairs, take an elevator, the pyramid, even the NYPD has taken us on a ride along with this, So all of these models, all of them have their shortcomings. So my core message in this question on the target group is the whole thing that everything that separates these individuals from us as an individual is the fact that they're an individual. So in every case, you have to take, we deal with our clients not in a group setting. We don't get 5 of them in a room, and we deal with everyone individually. And I think that is something that really has to find more awareness in this whole construct, that while this is really difficult to maintain in terms of resources, especially personnel, money, time, obviously, if it is supposed to be effective, that is the bullet you're going to have to bite, is to engage on eye level, at an individual level. When it now comes to the quantity, is that what you were asking me, Bibi? Let me phrase it quite loosely, a couple of dozen that we're engaged with, if that is satisfactory enough without having to state a
Well, since
crisp
it's
figure.
yeah, no, but because you're saying how on your last slide saying
Yeah.
how we don't see a higher risks
Yeah.
to violent behavior, and of course
Yeah.
that's the common understanding in most security and intelligence reports. How that's what they were.
Well,
how
that's
they come-
what's anticipated.
Yeah,
you know?
that's
Yeah.
what anticipates. So
Yeah.
it would be a very interesting finding, and would be in need for a sort of a reassessment of that
Yeah.
that anticipated idea, and to have a good knowledge and an end that makes a difference or a comparison to other studies.
Well, if you take the general cases that we're observing in Europe, in particular with jihadist motivated violence, is that if you look at the cases, how many of the actors actually are returnees. Now, this is a very highly charged topic, as we have a great contingent of European citizens detained in Syria and Iraq, and we're trying to figure out what to do, obviously. But these are not the only ones. We have around 100 plus individuals already that have returned to Germany over the past few years. So this is not a new threat. It's just now at this point we need to figure out how we're going to deal with this other bulk that we're anticipating, which is about the same, with around another 100. But if you look at these cases, you cannot say, okay, we have an impulse that gives us a direction of saying, okay, now these people are going to be a higher threat. They're battle hardened. All of that. This whole catalog of characteristics, they're not characteristics. They're pre-assumptions. And if we take a pre-assumption and continue with that and continue with that, you know, that's a little bit what got us into this mess, you know. So, yeah.
Just a quick question about the types of extremists or violent extremists that you deal with. Are they all jihadists, or
No.
do you have a mixed group of white nationalists, for instance?
Of course, we have a broader spectrum. So we like I said, we started out in working with right-wing extremists, and we do not only work in the prison system, but over the past 2 decades when we started out, to date, we have handled over 1,000 cases in prison alone, in exit work, disengagement, de-radicalization. The ratio depends on from time to time, so I could not make a very clear statement on but both perspectives are of high relevance for us.
Do you find similarities between these cases?
Well, yeah, it's especially in the terms of the underlying narratives that are used. You have a lot of cross references that actually has developed into the term of bridge narratives, which basically shows, basically how, for instance, common enemy profiles have been generated on different sides of extremist groups. Anti-Semitism being one common denominator. And that's actually, these bridge narratives are actually basically what gives a general, let me call it carefully, infrastructure for the dynamics of individuals changing their extremist milieus. So you might have a right-wing extremist that becomes a jihadist, vice versa. It's mind-baffling, but it happens.
Just to go back to your presentation, Margarita, especially when you mentioned the new age, basically the alienation that's coming out of the new age, the loneliness, the major social seismic changes in society and its impact on radicalization. How significant is this? Because in the 1980s and 70s, when in the first wave of jihadists and radicals on the Islamic side, it was basically an Afghan resistance movement, which changed into a more localized version, and then back into the globalized jihad with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, the later stages. But it seemed more like a coalition of local groups joining in for a global fight in Afghanistan, but with local incentives. So each of these had these local incentives. But now we're seeing a new generation, has to do more with these changes. More like the rapper profile. Reading Islam for Dummies or Quran for Dummies and joining the movement. How do you explain this? I mean, how do you explain this?
In one word, the internet.
Yeah.
We should pay attention to the fact that online community has developed in the past few years. And as you rightly stated, before, the radicalization was a local issue. People had ideas that they wanted to see performed in life. Nowadays, what we notice, and it's not only radicalization into extremism, but I also notice the same happening with young people getting engaged in gangs and organized crime because they no longer have communal relationships and they're increasingly spending their time home, alone, and online. They are eager to join the global community because it's easier, it's at the tips of their fingertips, right? With their iPhones and whatever other gadgets they have. And yes, Jihad for Dummies is widely available online, and unfortunately the companies that, Twitter and YouTube, the companies that are sifting through what content is available and what content should be banned, are just not capable of catching up. The amount of stuff available right now on the internet is mind-boggling. And that is what changes the narrative, because it's no longer a local issue, it is a global issue. You can read the news nowadays about something that happened across the globe.
So can we tackle the alienation at a social level, in a sense? How do you think about it when you're a policymaker? What is the approach to tackle these issues?
Well, as I said earlier, a key point is this screaming demand from European societies and politics for migrants, which is ironic because, you have a lot of people in France and Belgium and Germany that have Turkish or Arab ancestors and are actually in the second, third, fourth generation and still considered migrants, and we're screaming for integration. Now, integration, as I said, only works with socialization. So if there's no socialization, that's not going to happen. So there will be a sense of alienation. And that is something at a very fundamental level that we need to overcome. So that's the problem I can identify. I really don't have a roadmap for you. I wish I would. Or at least an impulse how to do that. But that is actually something we need to understand, because we cannot have a demand of integration without giving the conditions or recognizing that the conditions of that precondition is lacking. And this observance of Islam, Quran for dummies and whatnot, there's always been this implication that those who radicalize, or examples of those that have traveled to leave the country as foreign fighters, don't have really any theological depth and knowledge of the religion. So that raises the question of, if it's not the religion, what is it? So I personally, from my own research perspective, can consider the factor of the Arab Malays by Sami Kassir, the Lebanese author and journalist. I think that is a very powerful essay. If you combine that with some of the more historical approach of the Oxford historian Eugene Rogan, and you interconnect these perspectives of the perception of foreign domination and being suppressed by foreign powers to a certain degree, or at least the attempt of such. And if you transfer that into European society with a perspective of feeling alienated within a society where your parents have been born, but you're considered a migrant, of course, you have this component of the Salafi community being something that can, cover all of these deficits to some extent by affiliation. And if you observe that the socialization within the Salafi milieu is not really from my perspective, a religious theological socialization. It is more of a acculturation with, I believe it was Olivier Roy that's called it a pigeon Arab culture to some extent, or acculturation. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. So that the thing is, it is the overall victim narrative that is being communicated within that social group, and if you have a socialization within the Salafi milieu, that is something that is transferable. So if I feel like I've had a shortcoming in my expectations as a young person, what I should have accomplished in my sense of relative deprivation, that is something that can resonate within that structure very well without me having to being very literate of the Quran or Sunnah or Hadith. Yeah.
I would say, although yes, the internet plays a role, but I think that it plays a role in a much larger context, and it's more about the overall globalization that affects us all, or most of us. And what you see is that, for instance, if you look at the media and the channels that are available, there's been a democratization or sort of an emancipation that took place in that respect, which offers everyone an opportunity, if they have the means available, to put news out or point out hypocrisies or fake news, if you like. We see that in all kinds of fields that this is influencing our perspectives on things. I think we have to be careful to say that the internet plays a role in all of this, because if you look at certain communities in Nigeria, in Chad, in Mali, they don't necessarily have access to all these narratives. It's rather that they have very local grievances that the bigger international terrorist organizations kind of exploit, and they offer a platform and means and forms to give an outing to their local demands. So there is a different dynamic there. So we always have to keep contextualizing here. In terms of how I don't know how we can really turn that around, but it at least starts with our own behavior. And if we keep preaching rule of law and human rights, and at the same time trampling that in the same actions that we take, that's certainly not helpful in saying that we are right and they are wrong, because they are actually using the fact that the West or those who are fighting terrorism are making mistakes in doing so. They point that out as one of the reasons that they are fighting that. So if we keep doing that, that certainly keeps undermining our approach and our messages.
Just one last question before I open the floor for more questions on that side. I'm really curious about that one, because you mentioned white nationalists and the common denominations between them and jihadists, and at the end of the day we have the caliphate, and you mentioned something about the imagined grievances. Pretty much there are imagined communities, the jihadists all over the place, these groupings which end up in a violent struggle, just like the white nationalists. But would it help to shift, when looking at these movements, to shift the focus into the nationalism literature when we're studying these groups, and understanding, digging deeper into the narrative, and as you said, the socialization, the milieu that offers what the society has deprived you as an individual?
Well, I think in that context, what is the most important thing is to actually understand what are the preconditions of enhancing an individual's responsiveness to extremist thought. If we take that approach instead of the more individual specific characteristic of one different scene, I think that would be the most effective general approach to take. If there would be a change in approaches, that would be my position on that.
Thank you so much. Jordi Carrasco-Muñoz, working for the EU, for one of the plethora of instruments, the instrument contributing to stability and peace. My question is for Mr. Lindsey, possibly a double question. The first one is, I have the impression, forgive me if I'm wrong, that the model that you have been using in Germany focuses more on exemptions, on abnormalities in society. Now, how would you adapt that system to countries or situations like Iraq, where you have not just a handful of clients, but potentially tens of thousands of clients in prison wings were surrounded by other extremists and are difficult to be isolated and have that one-on-one treatment? And my second question would be, and together with that, you were talking about resocialization and reintegration, but what happens when the community itself may not be necessarily at odds with what this person had been doing? And the second thing I'd be interested to hear is about your perception between the similarities between the two groups you have been dealing with, the extreme right and the Islamist. And you were mentioning before Olivier Roy, and in what sense would you fall in the debate between Olivier Roy and Gilles Kepel of the Islamization of radicalization of Islam?
So the last question is not quite. Would you repeat that last part, please?
Yeah, you are aware of
Yeah.
that big debate.
Yeah.
And have you seen points in contact between these two groups that you have been dealing with, the extreme rights and the Islamists, to make you think that to some degree these people could have been interchangeable? They could have been one in the position of another if they had been surrounded by those circumstances.
Absolutely. I can answer that one right ahead. Absolutely. It actually depends on your socialization, the access to a certain extremist group. There are definitely individuals where you could say, okay, this could have gone a different direction, certainly. The other question is tough. How that can be transferred. Now, our approach, of course, into this regional context here, in particularly with Syria and Iraq. See, the main difficulty I see with that is the point that I touched on earlier, was this concept of the Arab malaise formulated by Samir Kassir. This is, of course, like you've said, a problem with much broader scope. So in relation to that, I really cannot tell you. I can identify that as the core problem from my perspective for the breeding ground for extremist ideology also here in this region. because I think something that is very crucial is we speak in Europe of homegrown terrorism. On the other hand, we speak of a global jihadi movement. And if we look at the origins and strongholds of this ideology, where it comes from, then we need to be able to interconnect all of it together to a broader concept and perception that we have on the topic of radicalization, as if it is in the MENA region or if it is in Europe. So that's actually the big point. But how to transfer immediately off of the top of my head, I could not tell you.
Can I just offer a thought? And this is also, I mean, I think it has an intriguing question and a very urgent question, your last question. And I think because how we're dealing with such sheer numbers that at the very well-developed, tailor-made approaches that can work if the numbers are still something that you can deal with. It clearly doesn't work if it's thousands and the surroundings are also still in shambles. So I guess it's sort of backtracking on what all the factors are that are these environment for radicalization or for taking this path towards violence, and see whether you can at first at least invest in that. And that's of course a long-term perspective. So you cannot offer these tailor-made approaches to the individuals. What you should do at least is make sure that rule of law is observed and that you make improvements there. And in terms of governance, I think, I guess what is interesting here is to look at the report that UNDP did for Africa in understanding how these pathways to violent extremism work. Understanding what are the root causes and particularly the trigger causes, how that make one person take that direction and another has still suffering what's happening but not going into violence. And so for really a great majority, it was government behavior or have violence used against themselves or a friend or a relative that triggered them really to join a radical organization. So if that's the big fault in the system, and of course you have to once again look at what it is in this situation to do the research, but to first correct that before anything else.
Shall we take more
Yeah, sure.
questions? Yeah. Dr. Bassem.
Bassem Shab, former member of parliament. I have a quick question. In Lebanon, we found it very useful to have the clergy and religious figures at the level of the community and individually. And the question is to the panelists. I haven't seen anything related to the clergy and the role of the clergy. There's a theological background to this problem, and how far are the clergy involved in communal work and de-radicalization?
So when it comes to our programs, our counselors, a majority of them are Muslim themselves. We, depending on the individual's need, of course, can rely on theological support from, an imam or whoever we can acquire to engage in dialogue with them. But in the very initial phase, it's actually more important, and the work is more focused on building an interpersonal relationship between the counselor and the client at a very individual level. And once this relationship builds and grows, that it might be a day where you go into the prison and have a conversation, and it's about the food and the blankets and day-to-day prison life, and that's all right. And then the next time you go in, because that is all part of building the relationship, and then at the next time it might be about something theological. Now, to some extent, of course, our counselors have knowledge that they can rely on to engage in such a dialogue. In other cases, yeah, we have the opportunity and also do it depending on the situation to maybe have them engage with it with another person. So it's, a lot of prisons in Berlin have imams, have Friday prayers. It is something that is conceptually integrated, and yeah.
I was just wondering about the use of reform jihadists in the de-radicalization process and how efficient it was. That's my first question. My second question, I might be going totally on a tangent. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a psychologist. How much you think the fact that we are the product in the Middle East of shame-bound societies, does it allow us to be easier victim, to fall more easily for, for the narrative of not just victimhood, of humiliation, of collective humiliation, and how can we tackle it? Are we tackling it at the the European level in terms of communities, and in avoiding or creating another type of mindset?
Can I just offer maybe an example of an organization called Spark, who is very much working on youth entrepreneurship and who did a program in Kurdistan, Iraq. And originally it was funded by the Dutch embassy. They were actually, they started off trying to work with youth on a social media campaign to counter narratives. Well, when they started off, they had a very steep learning curve because they understood quite clearly from the feedback they got when they were looking for young people to work on this program and to be the agents of this social media campaign, that they were first of all put off by the whole agenda under counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. That was not what was in their life, in their discussions. Like you say, sometimes you want to talk about blankets or about the food or something. And these were young people, students, full of promise, but in an environment that is devastating with all kinds of challenges ahead. They know that this is a problem for them and for their generation, that they might be tempted to join these organizations. So what they understood is that it's, instead of working on countering the narratives, it was far more important to start working on their identity, about who they are, what they stand for, what their future is, and to communicate that. And that turned out to be very successful. Sometimes it's something else that you need instead.
Thank you. I mean, I thank our panelists for the discussion. I'm sorry. Okay, just one last question. I can't refuse.
First, thank you for this panel. I have two questions. The first one, what if the society retaliate and absolutely refuse the idea of emerging? Would you drop the program? You already said that the government didn't really like or...
So, are you asking the question whether if a client is at a point where he doesn't want to collaborate with us anymore if we stop?
No, of the society, the outer society. Like what if Germany or the whole of Europe refused the idea of them emerging with the society again? They don't want them to come and emerge.
Hostile environment to research.
Okay, so what is your question?
What would you do? Would you drop the program?
No.
So how can you convince them that they should have like a second chance to emerge?
Well, I think the most successful tool for that would be able to present successful examples. So if you can actually show that the program works, and I think we can actually say with with a certain level of confidence, that our approach is effective. As I said earlier, we have over 1,000 examples of individuals from now these both spheres that I talked about, just in prison alone. So we also engage in different approaches where we go into schools at a primary a preventive level, and all of this actually has shown significant effect. So we get feedback from teachers of schools or principals of schools or the social workers in the schools saying, okay, this tension that we've had, maybe of intercultural tension, interreligious tension, has decompressed since you've engaged in our institutions. So those would be basically very valid examples that you could give out to eradicate such positions. Yeah.
Thank you. We really have to, and time is up. Thank you very much, and thank you for the panelists and the speakers, and thank you for attending the session. Thank you very much.